So on the one hand, you have a country like China or any other autocracy where, I know some people from China, and mostly what they say about political conversations is that they just don't happen, right? People just, for the most part, don't discuss it. There's just a boundary on what topics you can talk about. And within that boundary, you feel quite free, in fact, and in some sense, freer than Americans are to speak. But there just is a hard and fast boundary about what you can talk about in polite conversation. And that boundary is more or less chosen by the Communist Party, right? So that doesn't exist in America. Obviously, to the extent that there are boundaries on what you can talk about in polite conversation, those boundaries are imposed from the bottom up in some sense, or at minimum, not from the government, from the elite, right? By elite cues and by sort of the consensus of people with a certain status that have blue check marks on Twitter and so forth. And the related problem is that in many European countries, they are premised on the notion of a single ethnicity with shared values. And certain problems don't arise in that context, right? The problem is in Europe has been that different nations go to war with one another. And to the extent that nations go to war within themselves, different ethnic groups, that has in many cases been solved by simply creating nations that have one ethnicity with one religion. So there's a substantial a substantial body of agreement about values to begin with, right? There's a kind of unity. And then in the case of China, where that unity is sort of imposed from the top down, right? So those are two ways of you can get to unity, through autocracy or through just forming a nation that already has a substantial amount of unity to begin with, because it's the nation is a natural outgrowth of what was once an actual tribe of people. And then in America, you have a totally different case where we have freedom, we don't have autocracy, but we are extremely far from a single tribe, right? We're lots of different tribes with deep disagreement on values, and that's a problem that is very difficult to see how we make progress on, and it seems in my lifetime I've only seen it get worse as a result of social media and the way we consume information now, where you just get a personalized menu of events and opinions that are perfectly crafted so as to either confirm what you already believe or give you the worst impression of what the other side thinks about an issue so that you can dismiss them entirely. And on various measures of polarization, this problem has been getting worse. And so it is a deep question to ask, how do we update democracy for the 21st century, for a 21st century multi-ethnic nation that is committed to freedom and doesn't want to become an autocracy, doesn't want to impose unity from the top down, but nevertheless can't fall back on what works in other places that are also free, which is just having a sort of natural unity.
Oh man, you touched like 8 different things that would be nice if we can get into. I hope we come back and close some of these loops.
Yeah.
On the social media thing you mentioned, I'm not going to start there, but we should come back and double click on it because it's actually a really, it's a fundamental part. I believe you had Tristan Harris on recently, so we won't repeat that. It's a good one for people to listen to, I'm imagining. But there's a couple pieces in terms of that are all of the structures made in modernity were made on broadcast media, meaning some central broadcastability through a newspaper, through following the printing press, which then turned into radio, which then turned into television, which meant we could make sure everybody got similar messages. And so as soon as we moved to a decentralized kind of media where everybody could broadcast, and then there's way more answers than anyone can possibly look at. So then whoever controls the search algorithm or the recommendation algorithm is actually curating the information space. That's actually not just a change in magnitude, that's a change in type. That's a change in type in a very fundamental way of the nature of the technological infrastructure that is mediating civilization changing, and then the new civilization, the social tech, needing to change and having not changed yet. So that's a big one I'd like to come back to. But the most fundamental thing that you said is you can see examples where there is a certain kind of order that doesn't seem super top-down imposed. It seems more bottom-up or kind of culturally supported, where there is some kind of depth of shared culture that creates enough binding energy to overcome the cleaving energy between the differences of the people. You can think about what's going to hold a number of people together being a ratio of the cleaving and binding energy of that population, right? And when we study the history of sapiens, we can see that for the most part, for a few 100,000 years, the groups never got beyond a certain size, right? Famously, the Dunbar number. And it's a big question as to why, like what, but we see this in all other animals, right? Like chimpanzee troops are of a certain size, they get a little bit bigger and then they end up cleaving. And it similarly has to do with where does the bonding energy between them provide enough benefits to overcome the cleaving energy between, competing interests. But the fact that there's something like 200,000 plus years of human activity and with brains similar to the brains that we have, that never got above 150 people is like, oh, there's something very deep there to look at. And this is why many social philosophers talk about the fundamentally tribal nature of humans from an evolutionary bio standpoint and why it's important to understand that. There's a lot of ways we can think about the Dunbar number. One way is up to that number of people, I can know everyone very well. I can know everyone intimately. And we can actually all sit around. We can all participate in a single conversation. We can have a tribal council where if there's a big decision to make, everybody's voice could be heard within just literally mediated by the ability to speak and everybody hear it without a microphone or tech of some kind, and the time that it takes for all the voices to be heard to actually make a decision. And so if I'm going to live in a society where I'm going to be subjugated to the choices or be responsible to mediate the choices, I want to have a say in it. If we start to get to a situation where there's so many people that can't all have a say, then why would I just not cleave and go make a smaller group? So then the question of why did we start, when did the Dunbar number end, mostly has to do with a time period around the beginning of agriculture, movement from hunter-gatherer, largely nomadic cultures to agriculture, and a number of critical changes that occurred around then. But some of them have to do with, up till that point, human populations the population would actually outstrip the resource of an area. And then they would move. And so you'd get this migration. And this is why we can see that humans, wherever they started, ended up becoming apex predators across every single environment on the planet, where no other animal did that, right? Like that's a very uniquely human thing because we could make ourselves adapted to different environments through tools, clothes, and other kinds of tools. Once population starts to outstrip an area and you can't move anymore because we've done all the moving that's possible, then tribal warfare becomes an obligate situation to deal with resource scarcity. Once any group starts tribal warfare, all the other ones have to do it in an obligate way or they die by default. And so now you start getting a tribal warfare race, right? A kind of multipolar arm trap or arms race. And so now it makes sense for two smaller groups to unify together because they have more binding energy, which is they're going to die on their own. And so I'm willing to give up some of my choice-making freedom. I'm willing to be a part of a group I don't have as much a say in because the group that I have more say in on my own is going to die from some larger militarized group. Now, as soon as that group gets larger, then the other group gets larger. They both increase their weaponry. They increase their ability to do division of labor and coordinate and stores of resources and those types of things. And we call that kind of the evolution of empire. So it's important to understand that and this is actually why, when Machiavelli talks about the enemy hypothesis, that the idea that humans are tribal and they will keep breaking down to smaller tribal scales unless there is a unifying force. And the unifying force is almost always an enemy. Doesn't have to be, but there's actually social theory argument on this. I would say it doesn't have to be. But that generally what will unify a group of people together with a shared identity involves what is outside of that identity that needs them to be bound together. And so this is an important idea, is that you can have a shared identity, which we call a culture, that has everybody kind of police each other or create order with each other in a distributed way. And so that when we look at Japan or Singapore or the Nordic countries and look at the relatively lower crime, higher education, et cetera, and try to apply that to some huge diverse country like the US, we can see that they have certain cultural prerequisites in place we don't have. That's like a hard and really important problem. And it's why there are some people who are proponents of the idea the US actually needs to break up into some smaller entities that can have more cultural homogeneity. I think that is a definitely impossible way to do it, because all of the states, say we tried to separate it into a red nation and a blue nation or whatever subsets of nations, all the states have nukes. None of the forces in Europe or whatever, when we were dealing with kind of European rise, did. And so do you want groups that have so much enmity and antipathy with each other that they can't participate together and have to cleave, both having nukes with no defensible airspace in between them, sharing a border? Like that's a problematic situation to think about. So you either get order because of some shared cultural basis, or you get order because it's imposed, or you don't get order and you get chaos and the thing breaks down because of chaos. So if we say that civilizations fail either because of too much chaos or order that comes the wrong way through imposition, those are the two different failure modes. So what we need is emergent order. The emergent order actually has to be at the level of culture before being at the level of institution.